Did it pop up that it's recording? Yep. Hello, everybody. It's Dave Apsley with Ohio State University Extension, and we're going to do another virtual day in the woods. Today, we're going to focus on measuring the trees in your woods. And I've got Julie Strawser on as a co-host today. So she's going to do a little overview on how to use Zoom if you're not familiar with it, and then we'll get started.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to go a couple basic things with Zoom. First of all, you should be able to have a little chat icon that you can click on. And so if I want to test it, so if you go ahead and click on that chat, I want you to go ahead and type what county you are in today and then click enter. And that way Dave and I can get a feel for where everybody is across the state here. So everybody go ahead into the chats column, and I'm going to go ahead and put mine in.
And don't be afraid to play on Zoom. If you're not finding stuff, move your mouse all over the place. You'll eventually find the windows.
Yeah, sometimes the boxes will hide. So it looks like we have a good group. Summit, Lucas, Montgomery. All right, welcome everybody. So we get the chat down. There's also, so if you have a question for Dave, go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll get that addressed. It might not be right at the time you post that, but we will get to the chat. There's also a Q&A box. There you can submit a question anonymously if you don't feel comfortable submitting something in the chat box. Same thing, you just click that Q&A, type your question, and we will receive that. Then if you are not a typist or don't want to do the keyboarding, you should have an option to raise your hand. And at that point, we can unmute you and then you can ask your question. So lots of options to participate. Dave wants you to participate. So Dave, if you want to get started, and I'll back out here.
All right, welcome everybody. Today is our third virtual day in the woods, and we're glad to see we've got 23 participants on today. So it's a smaller group. We're hoping to be able to interact with you a little bit more today. And today we're focusing on measuring the trees in your woods. So Julie already answered this question. What I'm going to do from now on, when I have questions and want some interaction for you, I'm going to put a slide up like this. And then if you don't mind responding in the chat window, that would be great. So if you're not familiar, Day in the Woods is a program that started in 2012. So we're going on our 9th year with Day in the Woods. And normally it's an all-day program at the Vinton Furnace State Forest or one of our other state forests or another location like Hocking College. We had an agenda started and set for this year. But due to things totally out of our control, we are changing things up a bit. And we're finding that these shorter sessions seem to draw a lot more attention and it seems to allow more people to participate. So that's kind of our goal, is to kind of mix it up. And we will have topics on the second Friday of every month. It will probably just vary from this calendar. So I just wanted to remind everybody also that we've got lots of partners with Day in the Woods. Today, I'm the only presenter, but normally we have lots of partners involved behind the scenes and helping with the presentation of these programs. And if you are not already subscribed, I highly recommend that you go to this site and subscribe. Over here, you can subscribe by email. And then when we post updates on programs and provide materials, like I've already got a post drafted and ready to go with all the resources that you'll need if you want to go back and follow up with this program and see some of the videos and stuff. And I see Julie's typed that web link into the chat windows there as well. So just as a reminder, we did a video on how to make a tree measuring stick, how to put the Biltmore scale on, and how to put the Merit hypsometer scale on. If those are new terms to you, don't worry, we'll talk about those as we go today. But this video is out there and it's at that same web page. So if you have not had a chance to make your own stick, the directions are there. It's actually pretty simple and you can make a pretty accurate stick based on that. Also want to mention that these tables, this is the standard table that most people probably use, but I've got tables for a variety of arm reaches, and the video talks about how you determine your arm reach. One thing I wanted to mention that I don't know that was very clear in that video and later videos is that for your height measurements, that's going to change depending on your arm reach. So keep an eye on that highlighted number there, and when you do the tree height scale on your stick, make sure that you put the correct number in there or use that correct interval. couple other resources. Again, these are going to be on the resource page that I'm going to create and post as soon as we get the video from today. But this is a fact sheet that Kathy Smith and I put together a few years back. It goes into how to use a tree measuring stick, talks about the Biltmore and the Merit, and then some of the tables that are available for you to use. And then here's a little bit older fact sheet. Dr. Randy Heiligman was the principal author on that. That just talks a little bit more detail on how to estimate the volume of a tree, measure a tree's diameter and height, and so forth. So again, these will all be posted online. So, little interaction from you. Why would we want to measure trees? Can some folks, if you're comfortable, just type something in the chat window? Anybody got any thoughts on why we might want to measure trees? I see value, determine age. Okay, any other ideas out there for tree sales? Distinguish one tree form from another, determining age. Just interesting to know how old a tree is. Okay, so those are great ideas. With the age part, I won't discuss that much later, but diameter, trees get bigger with age for sure, but diameter is not alone a good indicator of age. We got to know how fast that tree's growing as well. So we need some additional information, more than we're going to get today, but that would be a great topic. So a couple reasons we need to measure trees. If we're going to have a sale, we want to know the value. That's part of it, but also for woodland management purposes. No matter why you own a woodland, you're going to need different information. And so for woodland management, we're going to need lots of different information, like those things like how old are the trees, how fast are they growing, how healthy are they mature. So there's a lot of measurements, but a lot of times it still comes down to at least a count of trees and some indicator of their size, and usually that's a diameter measurement. But then we can determine things like how crowded it is and how healthy the trees are, what kind of site they're growing on, and so forth. But for a product sale, we really need to know the volume of the product we're selling. And then we also need to know quality, which we won't have time to discuss much today. We were hoping to do that in our all-day Day in the Woods program, and then to estimate the value of the product. So to start things out, if we're going to measure trees and we want to know the volume or how much wood's in them, we need to be on the same page as far as what unit of measure are we talking about. So the unit of measurement that we use in the forest products industry is a board foot. And a board foot is equal to 144 cubic inches. So think about a piece of wood that's square, that's 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch thick. That's a board foot, but it can also be any combination of length, width, and thickness that give you 144 cubic inches. So if you take the length times the width times the thickness in inches, you're going to get cubic feet or cubic inches, and then you can divide to figure out how many board feet you have. So that's pretty easy. If we've got a board, we can measure length, width, thickness, but how do we do it for a tree? This is one of my favorite pictures of a yellow poplar tree or tulip tree from up in Mesquite County. Just a beautiful, straight, bold stem. Well, if you think about it, trees, especially that picture, are cylinders, but they kind of taper. They get a little bit smaller as we go higher up on the tree. So if we wanted the volume of a cylinder, we would need to know the diameter of that cylinder, and we need to know the length of that cylinder. And then in forestry, there's lots of different tables and formulas we can use to estimate the taper and to reduce for the loss of wood. If it goes through a sawmill, you're going to lose wood. You're going to lose these slab pieces on the outer edges, although we're losing less and less because our mills are becoming more and more efficient. And then we're losing sawdust, which takes out volume as well. The old mills had a 1/4 inch saw blade, so you lost quite a bit. Now they're 1/8 inch or sometimes even thinner. So the first variable or the characteristic we need to measure is the diameter of that tree. You're going to hear the term quite often, diameter at breast height, DBH. It's an old forestry term. DBH is diameter, and we take it 4.5 feet above the ground. And we also do that on the uphill side of the tree. And we'll talk about that. I've got a little video of me in the field to show you how to do that. So we'll reinforce that a little bit later. Some of the tools we can use are a diameter tape, which I'll show a picture of here in a little bit, a Biltmore stick, which hopefully many of you have made, and that's what we're going to feature today. And believe it or not, they do make big calipers that you can use to measure trees with, and they work very well. The problem is you got big arms and a big caliper, and for me, they don't make it through the day in the woods because I'll fall down and break the thing. But a diameter tape is a really interesting tool that was devised by foresters long ago. If you think about the relationship between the diameter of a tree and the circumference, there's a number out there, a constant called pi, which is 3.14. So these tapes that are called diameter tapes are actually calibrated so that each inch or each unit of measure, when it says an inch, is actually 3.14 inches long. So when we take that tape around the circumference of the tree, you're actually going to measure the diameter. If you have a regular flexible tape that you stretch around the tree, you can use that as well. But remember, that number is going to give you the circumference. So if you want to know the diameter, just divide that number by pi, or 3.14. As foresters, we like to use diameter tapes because we don't have to do that calculation at the end of the day, and the numbers we write down are already in diameter units. The next tool we're going to use, it's not nearly as precise. That diameter tape can give us pretty precise numbers to the nearest tenth of an inch. So if we want to know growth rates and things like that, diameter tape is a tool for you. But if you need a one-time measurement to get an idea what's in your woods for a product sale or just for management purposes, a Biltmore stick works perfectly well. And you've probably heard the name Biltmore and heard of the Biltmore estate down in Asheville, North Carolina. This stick was actually developed there in the forestry school that was up in the mountains, up in the cradle of forestry. Dr. Schenk and the folks designed this stick, and they started using it down there in the mountains years ago. So a Biltmore stick this is kind of a bird's eye view of how it looks when you use a Biltmore stick, but you're gonna hold the stick, if it's a standard stick, 25 inches from your eye. If you made a custom stick, whatever that arm reach length is, and then you're going to line your line of sight up with the widest portion of the tree, and then you're going to read off the scale what that number looks like. So I've got a short little video. Hopefully folks can hear this, and if you would please, when the video starts, just give me a thumbs up, or I can hear it or you can't hear, so I know that it's playing for you. Let's see what we've got going here. About a 4-minute video. I've got 3 of these we're going to use today. Forester and a natural resources specialist for Ohio State University Extension. Today I'd like to do a brief lesson on how to measure a tree diameter with a Biltmore stick. The Biltmore stick on a cruiser stick is that scale that has 0 on one end, and then it has graduations, usually at 2-inch intervals along the stick. Many of you have made your own stick, and we'll talk more about that later. But why would we measure the diameter of a tree? Why is that necessary? Well, as foresters, diameter is a really critical measurement to help us determine management options, determine how crowded the forest is, if it needs any activity. If we're going to do a timber harvest, we need to estimate the volume of wood in this tree. Trees are essentially cylinders that taper. They get smaller as we go up. So with the cylinder, to get its volume, we would need the diameter and the length of that cylinder. So what is the diameter? It's that measurement from one side of the tree to the other side across the tree. If the tree were cut down, it's the circle. It would be through the center of the circle from widest point to widest point. Well, that'd be a pretty simple measurement. You just lay a yardstick across there and measure in inches. Problem is, this tree is still standing. So we want to be able to measure that tree without cutting it down. So the way we would do that is use our Biltmore stick. Before we get started, the first thing you need to know is that the standard for measurement of diameter in forestry is 4.5 feet above the ground, or breast height. You'll see the term DBH, which means diameter at breast height. That's 4.5 feet, 4 feet 6 inches above the ground. For me, 4.5 feet on my body is right at my collarbone, so it's pretty easy to remember where that is. What I'd recommend for you is to cut a stick that's 4.5 feet above the ground and carry it with you for the first few times that you measure a tree. You lay the stick against the tree, and then you know where 4.5 feet is above the ground. The other thing you need to know is that we typically measure diameter at breast height on the uphill side of the tree. If we were to measure it from the downhill side, we'd be measuring it much lower and it would overestimate the diameter of the tree. So we want to get in the habit of approaching the tree from the uphill side, determining where 4.5 feet is above the ground, and that's the level that we need to measure the diameter of that tree at. So the next step is you're going to take your Biltmore stick and you're going to lay the stick on the tree at 4.5 feet above the ground. For today, I'm going to assume your arm reach is 25 inches. So every time I say 25 inches, keep in mind if you've made a custom stick that has a different arm reach, you're going to use that length. But for this stick, which is 25 inches, the stick needs to be against the tree. We want to make sure we're at the right height. We're going to line our line of sight, the edge of the stick, and the widest portion of the tree in a straight line. So we're going to zero this stick out by just adjusting the stick one way or the other so that it lines up with the widest portion of the tree. The other critical thing is to make sure that the stick is perpendicular to your line of sight when you're looking straight at the center. So again, line the stick up, zero in. The widest portion of your tree and your eye should all be in a line. And then without turning your head, keeping the stick at 25 inches from your eye, you're going to look sideways. And when I do, I get about 24 inches, just slightly under 24 inches in diameter. Remember, trees aren't necessarily round in cross section, so it never hurts to go at 180 degrees. You want to stay at the same height. Line up your line of sight, your eye, the stick, and the widest portion of the tree. Without turning your head, you want to look sideways, and I get right at 24 inches this way. So this tree is right about 24 inches in diameter, and we'll use that number later to determine the volume of this tree. Here's a close view of what it looks like when you're measuring a tree with a Biltmore stick. Remember, the stick should be 4.5 feet above the ground, and your arm reach, whatever the arm reach is on the stick, in this case 25 inches, it needs to be perpendicular with your line of sight. And then what we want to do is line up, keep your head straight, and line up the left edge of the stick with the widest portion of the tree. Something like that. And then we just look down the other side of the stick, and with our line of sight, line up the widest portion of the tree, the stick, and your eye. And wherever that line of sight crosses with the edge of the tree, that's the measurement of the tree. In this case, 24 inches DBH. So hopefully everybody was able to hear that. Just to make sure folks are still out there, where do we measure DBH on a tree? You folks don't mind sticking that in the chat window so I can make sure folks are still out there. 4.5 feet, 4.5 feet, good. Where else? What else do we have to take into account? Not only the height, but where else on the tree? Which side of the tree? Uphill side, great, we're seeing that. So it is important to do it on the uphill side and be consistent with that. Awesome, so folks are seeing that. So we're gonna move on and talk about measuring height now. When we measure height, I'm not talking about measuring the total height of the tree at this point. If you do wanna measure the total height of a tree, the tool that's pictured here is called a clinometer. Clin means slope, so it can be used to measure slope or heights of trees, but it's dependent on your distance from the tree. So this tool works pretty well. They're fairly expensive, probably, I haven't bought one in years, but probably around $150. They do work quite well, and you can measure a tree to within a foot or two in height with some precision. But today we're going to focus on measuring the merchantable or the saleable portion of the tree. And the unit of measure that we use in the forest products industry in Ohio is a log, and a log is 16 feet. And we typically measure to the nearest half log. Keep in mind, when you buy lumber, it's usually in 2-foot intervals, but we usually measure to the nearest half log. And then we also eliminate the stump. That hasn't shifted over the years. Stumps are much lower than they used to be, but we normally assume about a foot above the ground is our stump height. And then just for a standard today, we'll talk to about a 10-inch top. Again, the merchantable height and where you measure to is depending on what you're selling and who's buying it and what the product's going to be utilized for. If it goes into the paper industry, then they go to a much smaller top. If it's in the hardwood industry for more valuable hardwood products, a 10-inch top is by far is probably the minimum that they would go to. So tools, clinometer, I've just talked about, pretty precise within a couple feet. Merit hypsometer is a pretty good tool to measure if you need to get to about the nearest half log. And we always go to the nearest half log. We don't always round down or round up. Just go to the nearest half log. Otherwise, you're going to, typically folks say, well, it doesn't make 2.5 logs, so we're just going to call it a 2. Just go to the nearest half log, and then the average works out pretty well if you're measuring a bunch of trees. And there's a picture of Rachel, who's now with the Forest Service. That's probably a 15-year-old picture, using a Biltmore stick, or actually the Merit hypsometer on the cruiser stick. The other key thing when you're using that Merit hypsometer is you need to be 66 feet away from the tree. So we've got a little video on pacing on how to get that distance accurately. If you want a better measurement, or when you get started, you could use a tape to measure that out, but that's really tough with one person to do in the woods. But again, for that stick to work, it needs to be you need to be 66 feet away from your tree, and your eye needs to be at that point. And then we'll talk more about how we use that stick as we go forward. So I've got a short video on pacing, and then we'll move on to measuring tree height.
I'm a forester and a natural resources specialist with Ohio State University Extension. Today we're going to talk a little bit about pacing and how to determine the distance on the ground without any measuring devices. In order to pace accurately, you really need to calibrate your pace, and you need to spend a little time practicing. So what I've done here is stretch that tape out from the base of a tree to this point is 66 feet. You might ask, why 66 feet? Well, 66 feet is a chain. It's the old English measuring system. There's actually 80 chains in a mile and 10 square chains in an acre. So that math gets complicated when you get into that. But all you have to really remember is 66 feet. The reason we need to be 66 feet away from the tree is that the Merit hypsometer that we put on the tree measuring stick that we made is designed so that you're 66 feet away from the base of a tree to be able to get the height of that tree. So we need to practice, and we need to determine how many paces it takes to cover that distance. But many of you may not be familiar with a pace. A lot of people think a pace is a step. So each time you take a step, that's not a pace. What we recommend is pacing is every other step. So if you start with your left foot and count every time your right foot hits the ground, that's a pace. So again, 1, 2. The reason we do that, if you're pacing long distances, it's just easier to be consistent. You want to find a stride that's comfortable for you. You don't want to try to be 3 feet every time. You just want to walk at your comfortable pace, and you'll be more consistent. So again, when we pace, we count every other step. I usually like to start at the starting point, start with my left foot, and count every time my right foot hits the ground. 1, 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover this 66-foot distance, see how many paces it takes to cover that distance. We're going to do that probably a couple, 3 times to get an average, and then we'll just keep in mind that number of paces that we have to be away from the tree to be able to measure the height. So we're here at the starting point. We actually go to the side of the tree, and we're going to measure 66 feet away from the tree to determine that distance. Again, this is for practice purposes, and once you get your pace calibrated, you won't need to measure every time. So we're going to start at this flag. We're going to see how many paces it takes to cover it. Again, start with your left foot and count every time your right foot hits the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So for me, I'm right at 13 paces to cover 66 feet and have been for years. What I'd recommend is that you practice a little bit and record your pace to the nearest half of a pace. So if you end with your left foot again, then you would call it 13 and a half paces. So after practicing a few times, I ended up with 13 paces to cover 66 feet. So you don't really have to know how many feet you've got in a pace to do this exercise with measuring a tree height, but I like to know this number because sometimes I'll pace other distances. And for me, knowing that I've got 13 paces in 66 feet or in a chain, it helps me to measure distances and acreages and stuff just by pacing. So the math is pretty simple. 66 feet is the distance we covered. It took 13 paces. So each pace equals 5.08 feet, or 5.1 feet is a pretty good number for me to use. So 5.1 feet per pace. If I don't need to be super precise, I can just count by fives every time I take a pace, and I'm pretty darn close.
So just to make sure folks are out there, how many steps are in a pace? Can folks answer that? 2, good. And it's personal preference, but pacing over time is just so much more relaxing and easier to keep up with the number if you're counting every other step. I can only count so far, so for me to be able to count to 13 versus 26 is a little bit easier. So what's that unit of measure that what do we call that 66-foot unit of measure? Does anybody remember what we call that? It's a chain, good. And I see from somebody, it says, depends on your stride. So for most people, a pace is still 2 steps to make up a pace. Now the length of the pace is going to vary on your stride, but there are 2 steps in a pace, and it is a chain. Actually, if you get used to pacing in chains and you know that there's 10 square chains in an acre, you can figure acreage pretty quickly using the pace or using a chain and pacing in chains. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. I got one more video. I appreciate you guys hanging in with me, but I just hate just giving a PowerPoint presentation. So we spend a little time on these videos, and these videos will be available for you later to watch. So if you want to go back and review them or share them, they will be out there, and we'll talk about how to get to them in a second.
Hi, I'm Dave Apsley, a natural resources specialist and a forester for Ohio State University Extension. Today we're going to talk to you about how to measure a tree height. If you remember, when we made these tree scale sticks, we put a scale on the backside, which is the merit hypsometer. This scale is meant to be used when you're 66 feet away from the base of the tree, and each of these numbers represents one 16-foot log. So at 66 feet away, if you're using this stick, we can determine the number of 16-foot logs to the nearest half log. The first part about measuring a tree is really to determine where on that tree to measure. And what we want to look for is to the point where that tree is no longer saleable or merchantable or usable. So typically we'll go to about a 10-inch top. I typically look at a tree, and if it's an oak or something that has a major fork, a lot of times that major fork right below the major fork is where we're going to measure to. Sometimes there are usable pieces above that and we'll go above it. But in general, when you have that first major fork where the tree really splits off is where we're going to measure to. Where it's a little more difficult is a tree that has this nice gradual taper, something like a tulip tree or a yellow poplar. With that, it just takes some experience. You want to shoot for where you think that 10-inch top is, and that's where you want to take the measurement to. So let's look at this northern red oak that we measured the diameter on the other day and figure out where we want to measure the tree to. So right now I'm about 33 feet away from this tree. I don't like to look at a tree from right at the base to determine where to measure to, but as we go up this tree, we're going to get to a point where there's a major fork. I'm going to put a finger in here. It's about to that point right there. So we start at the base of the tree. Yes, we have a few limbs that are going to affect the quality of that tree, but we're probably going to be able to use it all the way up to that major fork. See if we can zoom in and you can see that major fork. Step off to the side and you can probably see it better without this sugar maple in the way. There's the major fork. So we're standing here at the base of the tree and we're trying to figure out what direction we want to pace to be able to get the height of the tree. I like to kind of scout this out as we're going, but I'm trying to avoid pacing across drainages like this. I also don't like to pace straight up a hill or straight down a hill, because really the best place to measure is normally at perpendicular to the slope or on level ground away from the tree, as level as you can get. So what we're going to do is pace out our 66 feet here and get away from the tree, and we'll show you how to use the merit hypsometer. Now that we've determined where we want to measure to on this tree, the merchantable portion of the tree, which is again right below a major fork on this big red oak, we want to pace 66 feet away from the tree, which for me is 13 paces. And when we're standing 66 feet away from the tree, we need our eye to be at that point, not the stick. That's a common mistake that people make. The eye needs to be 66 feet away from the tree, and then your stick needs to be held at whatever arm reach distance it's designed for. In most cases, that's 25 inches. So again, hold the stick 25 inches from your eye. Line up the base of the stick about a foot off the ground, which is what we call the stump height, and then the stick needs to be held vertical. If the stick is not vertical, we're going to overestimate. If it's leaning back towards you, you're going to underestimate. So again, we want to try to be vertical. Line the base of the tree up or the stump up with the base of the stick. Hold the stick vertical and then get your measurement. In this case, it's just under 2.5 logs. So here's a view of that tree from the distance of 66 feet. It's the bigger tree right there in the background. We're looking up. It's really difficult to see because it gets kind of fuzzy there. But right there where the bright sunshine is in the middle is that fork. So we want to go just below that fork to get the height of the tree. I've only got 2 hands here, so we're going to try to make this happen. So again, hold the stick up so it's lined up with the stump height, and we're going to look up the stick until we see that point lining up next to the tree, and it's 2.5 logs.
Okay, hopefully that was audible to you. If it's not, again, you can play that and set your own volume when you play it back. I'll have it available to you. But just as a little review, how long is a log or how tall is a log? Got 16 feet, good. Good. And how far do we need to be away if we're going to use that merit hypsometer the way it's designed? You could design your stick for different lengths and different distances, but that seems to be the standard 66 feet. Awesome. And then finally, oh, another question, where should we line the bottom of the stick up with visually? How far off the ground? Anybody remember? 1 foot, that's stump, good. And then finally, what kind of a fork do we usually measure to? And I got to have a little fun with this because after playing that video, I don't know how many times I said major fork. It's kind of embarrassing, but hopefully you get the point. So when you get a big fork where it branches into usually 2 or 3 more, that's the point where we're going to measure that tree. And I like to go just below that where you no longer have swelling. So you don't want to do right at the fork. You want to get below the point where it starts to swell out. So now that we've got diameter and we've got a height measurement, we can actually determine the volume of a tree or how many board feet are in that tree. And the standard in Ohio in a lot of the forest products industry in the eastern United States is the Doyle Log Rule. A little information on Doyle. It was published by Edward Doyle in 1825, so things haven't changed much in the last almost 200 years now. It's great for logs between 26 and 36 inches in diameter. It can be pretty accurate. And again, it assumes a 1/4 inch saw curve. So if the new modern mill is using an 1/8 of an inch saw curve, it's going to underestimate. But if you think about 1825, the average diameter of a tree was probably a little bit bigger. What we're finding is that on smaller logs, it really underestimates. If you get down around a 12 or a 14 inch diameter tree, it's going to underestimate volumes quite a bit. And it actually will overestimate some of the large, extremely large logs. But what's nice about it, it's a very simple formula. If it's it's D minus 4, that's the diameter on the small end of the log, minus 4. So diameter in inches minus 4, you square it, divide it by 16, and then multiply by L, the length, you're going to get the volume. If we're using a 16-foot log, it's just D minus 4 squared. So a 16-foot log, that's 14 inches in diameter. You subtract 4 off of it, you get 10, and you square it. It's got 100 board feet in it. So it's a pretty simple log rule. You don't have to remember the formulas because there are tables that I will also publish on our web page. I'm going to make a note to do that. But I can publish those on the web page if you want to be able to use those. But just realize, and it's important to know, because if you're a landowner and you're selling timber, it's just important to know that Doyle Log Rule probably is going to underestimate the volume of the trees that you're measuring. And that's all right if everybody understands that. If the buyer and the seller know that, they can adjust prices accordingly. But if you have to look until you get about 28 inches in diameter, and again, that's 28 inches log diameter on the small end. So that's a big tree. You got to get around 28 to 30 inches before you break even with international log rule, which is probably the most precise log rule that's there. So it's just a good thing for you to know. Another thing to know is that's a log rule that's made to determine the volume in a log. So what we've got to know is what the diameter of the small end of that log is, and that's diameter inside bark. So when we're standing at the base of the tree, we need to know what the diameter is at the top of the log. So we're up over 16 feet. You got to take into account there's a stump as well. So over 17 feet is where we want to know the diameter. So obviously we can't measure that. I'm only 5 foot nothing, so I can't reach that. But we assume a form class, and this varies by species, but the normal that we use in Ohio that seems to work pretty well is form class 78. And all that means is the relationship between the diameter at breast height at 4.5 feet above the ground, the relationship between that and the diameter at the top of that first log is 78%. So if it's 10 inches in diameter down here, it's 78% of that up there. So if it's 10 down here, it's 7.8 up there. If it's 20 down here, it's 15.6 up there. So we make that assumption that the taper is that. If you wanted to get a little more precise, you might change that depending on the species you're doing, but in general, standard is 78. So just keep that in mind. I know that's a little more complicated math, but some folks might be interested in that. And then there's a thing called a volume table. And a volume table basically just takes into account tree heights and taper, and it gives you a volume for a tree based on one or more tree dimensions. So the standard classic volume table for Doyle, this is for a tree, and this is assuming 78% or a form class of 78. We've got a diameter. So if you remember, the tree I measured was 24 inches. We've got a height. If I go across to 2.5 logs, that's how many board feet would be in that tree. And so I will make some of these tables available to you as well, Doyle and International. If you are working as a private woodland owner, you got somebody with a portable mill, you want a little better estimate of the volume you're going to get, I'll share a couple other log rules out there. But it's really that simple. We get a diameter with our Biltmore stick, we get an estimate of height with the Merit hypsometer, and then we just look up the volume on the table. So at this point, that went a little quicker than I thought, but I would be glad to take questions. If you want to raise your hand, and I will try to look for that, or if you've got questions that you want to put in the chat window, I would be glad to try to monitor and answer those. I'm not sure if Julie's back on with us. She had to join another call. But if you have questions, please type them in. Folks still out there? Julie, can you hear me?
Hey, I can. I'm here.
Okay. The other thing I want to point while we're thinking about questions that you might be interested in, this table is all the stuff I've got posted ready to go as soon as this video is ready. And so I've got the video on how to make the stick. I've got the tables for making the stick. I've got all the videos that we shared today with you. I will post today's PowerPoint, the actual slides, and the recording if you want it, and those 2 fact sheets. So lots of information's out there. And if you have trouble making that stick, or if you have a question, like for instance, if your arm length is a lot longer or shorter, I'd be glad to, I've got that in a spreadsheet. I can crank out whatever arm length you want. Or if you just run into a problem, don't hesitate to reach out. My email and my contact is right there. So please reach out. Any questions out there before we, okay, how does one pace over uneven terrain? Example, a stream. Okay, so I do see some questions. So that's tough. It takes practice. After you do it a bunch, you're going to get a really good feel for what 66 feet is. And then with practice, I would recommend, doing some practice on different terrains. And foresters that are real experienced will adjust their pace if they're on steep slope. They know that, they'll make a little mental adjustment and maybe take an extra pace at the end. But the best thing you can do is stretch a tape out there pretty regularly and measure it, and then just practice, practice, practice. I do see Nancy's got her hand raised, so I'm going to allow Nancy to talk here and see what her question is. Now you're going to have to unmute yourself, Nancy. It looks like you're muted on your end.
I'm answering late, so you may have already answered this. But I was wondering, how do you estimate the height of a tree?
Yeah, we covered that. We have a whole video on that, on using that merit hypsometer, and that's out there, and we'll share that with you. Or if you want to hang on after everybody's gone, I can give you a quick review on that too.
Thanks.
You're quite welcome. The fact sheets will be posted, William, on the site. So that link is, I've got it drafted already. I'm just going to wait for this video to render, and then by the end of today, or probably by lunchtime, I will post that post at the Southeast Ohio Wood site that Julie posted a little bit later, and the fact sheets are going to be there. So lots of good information there. Got a question from Michael about, could you use a rangefinder? Absolutely. I actually got out of my COVID box the other day and went to the woods with a postdoc who's working for the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And he was using a rangefinder and actually an optical tool to measure tree heights. But a rangefinder would be phenomenal if you had a good, accurate rangefinder. And there are actually some other tools we could use to estimate that, but a rangefinder would work really well. And it's just one of those things you want to practice and make sure. And then use your pace to get approximate, use your rangefinder to hone in would be a really good way to go about it. So thanks for asking that question, Michael. Alan's got a question. So let's see what Alan's got to say here. You're muted as well, I think, Alan, so you might have to change your mic. Wait on him to see if he, there you go.
All right. My question, Dave, is how often should we inventory our wood lot? In other words, cruise it, look for the quality trees, take measurements, get some idea about how many board feet of a species that we have in our.
So, Alan, there's no easy answer to that question, but it really depends on you as a landowner and what your goals and objectives are. I always tell landowners, if you're a new woodland owner, you want to get a good inventory done. You want to do it yourself, or you want to hire somebody to do it. So you have a baseline, and then you have an idea what the value of those trees are. So initially is a great time to do that. And then it really depends on your goals and objectives. If you really want maximum timber production and you want frequent inventories to monitor what's going on, it's also a good idea. I should mention this too. When we inventory our woods, we typically, if you own more than a couple acres, you're not going to measure every tree. So that's a whole nother topic of how we sample and we estimate the whole woods based on smaller plots that we put out. But really, I'd recommend a relationship with a forester who's helping you with the management, either your state service forester or a consultant, and then on a fairly regular interval, update a management plan. And, at about a 10-year interval is probably the norm. Not something you need to do every day, but it's also a great excuse to get out and systematically cover that woods and see what's going on. See if you got mortality from insects or disease, and that way you can monitor. Julie, am I missing other questions?
Well, we did have one in the Q&A. I'm not sure, from Ricky. It says, will you have tables for using the international scale? So I'm not sure if
I will put that in there too. Yep. There's actually the three that are most common are Doyle, International, and then Scribner, which is used more in the South. So I'll be sure to post some volume tables. And what I'll probably do is post the 1/4 inch and the 1/8 inch log rules. So if it's going to a bandsaw mill, you'd use the 1/4 inch log rule, or I'm sorry, the 1/8 inch. If it's going to a traditional old circular sawmill, the saw kerf is a 1/4 inch. So there's slight differences in the volumes there.
I think we've got them all, Dave. I don't see any new ones.
Well, great. And again, my email and phone are here. Feel free to text or email me at any time if you run into problems or you're just not getting it right or you're not seeing it when you're measuring those trees. The other thing to do, and I didn't mention, is if you do have a cloth tape or a flexible tape of some kind, it doesn't hurt to measure that tree's diameter. So if it's not calibrated as a diameter tape, get the circumference with the regular tape and divide by pi. Get the actual number, and then you can check how accurate you are with that Biltmore stick. So it's always good to just make sure it's working, that you're seeing it right. And then once you can consistently get what you measured, then run with the Biltmore stick. Well, don't run with the Biltmore stick. You might get hurt, but go ahead and use it. I should have done a video as well. Is the custom or the commercial available Biltmore sticks are really fun to fly too. If you throw them just right, they're fun as well. So with that, if there are no more questions, everybody have a great Friday. And I would say spend some time in the woods, but if you're going to do it quick and then get back in where it's cool, because that humidity is brutal out there. So everybody have a great day and drink lots of water, stay hydrated. All right, we're going to sign off and I'm going to shut the recording off. I can figure out how to do that. Stop recording.